All right, Shadle. Welcome to our lecture over period 5 in the AP curriculum framework. Period 5 covers 1844 to 1877. A very important time period. I could definitely see a DBQ over this time period. And really kind of the three areas of focus for period 5 is first expansion. America, we're going to expand. But also there's going to be problems with that. We talked about, the rap song. You could look it up. Mo money equals mo problems. Well, it's the same thing here. Well, the same but different. More land equals more problems. And that's going to be, so as we expand, we're going to have lots of problems. And obviously, those problems are going to be over slavery, or most of the problems are going to be over slavery. So we have expansion in the 1840s, problems with that expansion, and then ultimately a civil war and then Reconstruction. So that is a time period. That's why it goes to 1877, which is usually the end of Reconstruction, Compromise of 1877, and then 1844 with the election of James K. Polk, who was an expansionist president. So we start off first with this idea of manifest destiny. This is the idea that was coined by John L. O'Sullivan. He was not a politician, he was a journalist. But essentially, manifest destiny is this idea that Americans and white Americans were chosen to expand from sea to shining sea. Not the Mexicans, not the Native Americans. It was the white Protestant Americans were chosen by God. It was their destiny to stretch from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And we're going to see this in the 1840s. And this brings us into conflict with Native Americans, which is nothing new, but also now with Mexico. We're going to have a war with Mexico. So this really begins in 1844 with the election of James K. Polk. He kind of modeled himself after Andrew Jackson. And he was elected on an expansionist platform. So as a Democrat, you have your platform. The major political parties have their platform. These things are agreed upon at the convention. So the Democrats and the Republicans will do that this year. They'll choose their platform, and they'll vote on it, on the things that are important to them, whether it's gun rights, abortion, whatever. James K. Polk is running as an expansionist. He's going to expand. Really, he wants to get California. That's going to be the big thing. And then the Oregon Territory. And he does that. He is successful. And he only serves one term by design because he got everything he wanted to get done. But then he dies shortly after his term ends. So we see issues with Texas are going to be brought up during Andrew Jackson's term. Texas is going to get their independence from Mexico. This was a region that not a lot of Mexicans actually lived in. Most Mexicans lived south of this area. And for a while, they actually encouraged white people to move to Mexico. And of course, most of the white people are going to be from the southern part of the U.S., which means that they're going to bring their slaves, even though Mexico had outlawed slavery. But soon, white people in this area outnumbered the Mexicans. And then they decided they wanted to be annexed by America. And so first they need their independence, and so they get their independence. But America and the presidents are reluctant to annex or to take Texas, mainly because they believe that annexing or taking Texas will do two things. It might lead to war with Mexico, which it did, and it might lead to a fight over the expansion of slavery, which it ultimately did. So for 9 years, Texas operated as its own country while they were waiting for America to annex them. So Andrew Jackson didn't want to annex Texas because of a fear over war and the spread of slavery. Martin Van Buren did not, and then John Tyler at first didn't. But once James K. Polk is elected, basically saying that we're going to get Texas and the bigger prize was California, John Tyler ultimately annexed Texas on his way out. So this does lead to war with Mexico, 1846 to 1848. It was about 18 months, I think, the war. And really the war was over the boundaries of Texas. We wanted it to stretch all the way to the Rio Grande River, and they thought it should be the Nueces River. And ultimately we prevailed. We won that war, and we got the modern southern border of Texas. So this Mexican-American War is a big turning point in our trek towards civil war. In a way, I think of it as the French and Indian War was a cause of the American Revolution. The Mexican-American War was a cause of the Civil War, because we're going to get pretty much the whole southwestern part of America: New Mexico, Arizona, California, Texas, Utah, all of those. We're going to get all that territory with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that will lead to a fight over the spread of slavery. Should slavery spread to this new territory? And so the Mexican-American War is a huge cause of the Civil War, something that we could see as a DBQ. So during this time period, also America is growing. Things with the market revolution, expansionism, finding gold, all that stuff, and more opportunities is going to lead to an increase in immigration. So in the 1840s, huge influx of immigrants coming to America, mainly from Ireland and Germany. And this is what we refer to as the old immigrants. This is versus the new immigrants, which came really in the 1890s. And so old immigrants are more likely to be Northern and Western European. New immigrants in the 1880s, 1890s, more likely to be Southern and Eastern European and Asian. So there's going to be a lot of nativism. This is kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. A lot of people were, because America is mainly Protestant, a lot of people were anti-Catholic, and so the Irish were mainly Catholic, and so there was a lot of anti-Irish feeling in America, and they would even put signs up in the stores saying "Nina" or "No Irish need apply." And in many ways, the Irish were viewed, like at the same level as slaves, or sometimes even lower than them. And so there's going to be a lot of tension between free blacks and Irish, because they're doing kind of these low level jobs. And most of these immigrants are coming to the northern part of the United States, mainly because that's where the jobs are. So the North is going to grow much faster than the South. And as you have, the more people you have, the more representation you have in Congress, and therefore the more power you have in Congress, and the more electoral college votes you have in presidential elections. We also see kind of the beginnings of imperialism here, where we're opening up relations with Japan. That will increase more after the Civil War, especially in the 1890s with the Spanish-American War, but we sort of see the beginnings of imperialism here. The gold rush in California. So after we get California in 1848, a lot of people are going to move to California. And so this group is known as the 48ers, right? That's why the football team's called the 48ers. Just joking. They're the 47ers. So a lot of Chinese are going to move. They're not going to find gold, though. So because gold's already taken, so most of them are going to be working on the Transcontinental Railroad. So we see Chinese working on the Transcontinental Railroad in the west, and a lot of Irishmen working on the Transcontinental Railroad in the east. And we also see Native Americans. The reservation system is beginning now, and we will talk more about that when we get to the 1930s. So we'll begin our trek towards the Civil War here. So again, the three key concepts of this era are expansion, problems with expansion, and then Civil War and Reconstruction. So because of the South, because of their dependence on slave labor and that system, we're going to see slow population growth. So most immigrants are going to go to the North, and the South didn't really care about that because they were making so much money off of exporting cotton. But the North is now growing. It's becoming more industrial. That's where the banks are and all that stuff. We're also going to see the abolitionist movement that grew. If you looked at that with those reform movements from the last period, taped worm. But the abolitionist movement's going to grow. Famous people like William Lloyd Garrison of the Liberator, calling for immediate abolition of slavery. A lot of people were arguing, oh, slavery will die out on its own. We don't need to do anything about it. It'll just go away. And they had been saying that since the 1700s. But it wasn't going away. If anything, by the early 1800s and into the mid 1800s, it was reinvigorated. It was growing. Even after the slave trade was abolished in 1808, the international slave trade, internal slave trade was still going on, but slavery was growing. It was very profitable for these farmers. So we see William Lloyd Garrison. We looked at John Brown, the famous abolitionist, who I think kind of gets a bad rap, seen as kind of crazy because he was fighting to free the slaves. And for a lot of white people, it was, well, he has to be crazy if he's fighting to free the slaves. What white person would do that? So I really think that John Brown should be celebrated as a hero. We see Harriet Beecher Stowe, who published Uncle Tom's Cabin, showing the brutality of slavery. And it's reported that when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, that he said, oh, so you're the little lady that started this whole war. This just kind of shows the effect that cultural things, books and all these things that they can have on our views. The South is going to argue that slavery is a positive good, that it's good for them to be slaves. People like John C. Calhoun, who was the former vice president. This is a vice president saying that slavery is good for them. So this idea that this was kind of a fringe belief, no. I mean, we see, former senator, former vice president saying these things. So there's going to be various attempts at compromise. I think this is definitely fair game for a DBQ. The time period before the Civil War, I've seen a DBQ like this before. So here's just some of the things that could pop up if there was a DBQ from this time period. It could start with the Missouri Compromise, which we looked at last period, the Wilmot Proviso, which was during this declaration of war, during the Mexican-American War. This was added to it, saying that if we get any territory from Mexico, there would be no slavery there. Now, this never passed, but it shows the tension over the spread of slavery. We see the Compromise of 1850. This is going to be the last compromise of that great triumvirate: Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. These three senators, really, that probably had more power than some of these presidents. I think prior to Lincoln and maybe James K. Polk in the 1800s, the Senate's really running the show, not the presidents. The presidents get much stronger in the 1900s, really beginning with Teddy Roosevelt. But Henry Clay is kind of largely the one leading this compromise, and these old senators, they all died after this. and we get an influx of new senators who really weren't as willing to compromise, which I think is one of the reasons why we get the Civil War. But with the Compromise of 1850, California enters the Union as a free state. Slavery in Utah and New Mexico would be decided by popular sovereignty, sometimes called squatters' sovereignty, where the people living in that region would vote. So they would hold an election, or they would hold a vote, sorry, not an election. But the people would vote. Do we want to become a slave state or a free state? Thereby making it a local issue, not a national issue. Slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., not slavery itself. And really the one thing that the South got was a strict Fugitive Slave Act. Compromise here. Things are changing, though. We see in Illinois, Stephen Douglas, senator there, wants to build a transcontinental railroad. The question is, where is the railroad going to be? Is it going to be in the South, in the North, in the middle part of America? And because wherever the railroad is, that's where the cities are going to spring up. That's where jobs are going to be. So Stephen Douglas of Illinois wants the railroad to essentially go from Chicago all the way to California. And in order to do that, he needs to incorporate some new territories. This is essentially no man's land. It's Native American land, so they're going to take land from the Native Americans. They had been doing that for years. So they do that. They incorporate two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Now, as they are incorporated, we can now build a railroad through it. The question is, again, as we get more territory, what about slavery? And so what Stephen Douglas says is that the people living in these two regions should be able to decide if they want slavery. So popular sovereignty. The assumption was Nebraska, because it's close to Iowa, which was a free state, would be a free state, and that Kansas would be a slave state because it's near Missouri. And this is essentially repealing the Missouri Compromise because it allowed for the possibility of slavery being north of that 36 parallel line. So if you look at a map, Kansas and Nebraska are north of that line. And so this essentially is going to repeal the Missouri Compromise. In response to this, we see the creation of a new political party. It's going to be called the Republican Party. And so this is kind of that third party system now where we have the Republicans and Democrats. So 1854, we have the Republicans and Democrats, which we still have today. And the Republican Party is pretty much a free soil party. And so this is Abraham Lincoln. And the belief here is not abolitionism. So abolitionism is essentially we should get rid of slavery because it is morally wrong. Free soilers, as Lincoln was and as many Republicans were, they were opposed to slavery for economic reasons. If slavery spreads, that means there's less jobs for poor white people. And so really they're opposed to slavery for economic reasons, not really for moral reasons. That's an important difference. So a lot of Republicans are going to criticize people like John Brown and William Lloyd Garrison. So a lot of tension now building in America. We get things like the Dred Scott court case, which essentially allows slavery in all territories, not all states, but all territories. And so that was a big win for the South. And so it seemed like they would kind of celebrate, but they didn't. They viewed that everyone in the North is essentially John Brown and that they're coming to destroy slavery. And so we see in 1860 a big election. Abraham Lincoln's going to win. And for many, and again, he's not campaigning in the South. He wins. He's not even on the ballot in the South. And he wins, barely. There was more people, so there was essentially 4 different candidates. 3 of them were pro-slavery to different degrees. And so more people voted for, if you add up all the pro-slavery votes, they outnumbered the votes for Lincoln. But Lincoln, because of our electoral system, Lincoln wins in the Electoral College, which is where it matters. And so America is really divided at this point. And so when he is elected, again, this is November when he's elected, he's not sworn in until March. That time period known as a lame duck session, we see the secession of 7 southern states. And these are the 7 southern states with the highest percentage of slaves. Because for them, they think that they have just elected John Brown. They think Lincoln and John Brown are essentially the same person, even though they weren't. And Lincoln even criticized John Brown. So there's the last effort at compromise, the Crittenden Compromise, which would have been the 13th Amendment, which would have guaranteed slavery where it existed in the states, but not allowed it in the territories. And the South rejects it because they think that they have a right to slaves and should be able to take them wherever they want, which, the Supreme Court agreed with. So this compromise failed. And now we see the beginnings of the Civil War. So in April of 1861, we see the Battle of Fort Sumter. And so this is really going to be the first major battle of the Civil War. And Lincoln never recognizes the secession of the South. And which, by the way, after Lincoln's sworn in, we see and after Fort Sumter, we see the secession of the other southern states. They create the Confederate States of America. Lincoln never recognizes their secession. And the question is, what do you do with all these federal territories, or federal things that you have, military bases? What do you do about delivering the mail? Lincoln just says, we're going to go on with business as usual. The South hasn't left. They are just in rebellion. And so he needs to resupply Fort Sumter. They're running out of food and supplies. As he does that, they're shot upon, and thus beginning the Civil War in April of 1861. So the good thing is you don't need to know a lot about the battles during the Civil War. Really, the kind of the 2 battles that you do need to know, you need to know because of their political consequences. And so we see the Emancipation Proclamation. This is 1863, so the Civil War starts in 1861. Again, Lincoln's arguing he's not fighting this war to free the slaves. If he could end the war and free the slaves, he would do it. If he could end the war and keep slaves, he would do it. He was fighting because the South rebelled. They were in rebellion. He was fighting to keep the country together. That's what he's claiming. And he's saying essentially, slavery is okay in the South. We just don't want it to spread. So the war really, I would argue, originally wasn't over slavery, but it became a war over slavery. And it became a war over slavery in January of 1863 when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And he does this after the Battle of Antietam. So Antietam was important because Lincoln was looking for a military victory in order to release this. And Antietam was that victory, which really wasn't much of a victory. And that's the battle that we saw at the beginning of the movie Glory that we watched. But anyways, the Emancipation Proclamation, what it does not free all slaves. It's important to know that. It only frees the slaves that were in the states that were in rebellion. So there were some of these border states like Kentucky that stayed in the United States. So there were a few slave states that stayed in the United States, the border ones. They didn't have a lot of slaves, not like South Carolina, but they had slaves. And so they weren't in rebellion, so they were able to keep their slaves. So it's kind of interesting because the only place in the United States they could legally have slaves was in the Union after the Emancipation Proclamation. So a few different reasons why he does this. Slave labor helps the Confederate economy. If we can free those slaves, it'll hurt them. The North needs a boost of morale. Now, some people didn't like that this was now a war over slavery. A lot of Northerners didn't like that they were now fighting to free the slaves. But many did. And Lincoln also recognized, because he was really a master politician, that public opinion was swinging towards emancipation. He saw the public was turning this way, and so he was going to be on the right side of history, if you will. And also, Britain and France thought about helping the Confederacy because of their, addiction to cotton, that they may help the Confederacy, whether with loans or weapons or even troops, and really making this a war over slavery made sure that wasn't going to happen, because there's no way the British public would support fighting a war on the slave side. Britain had got rid of slavery, 30 years prior to this. And free blacks would now be admitted into the Union Army, and we saw that in the movie Glory as well. So Civil War ends 1865. Lincoln's assassinated, all that stuff. We get the 13th Amendment in 1865, which outlaws slavery. The only place that there was slavery at this point was in the border states. And so slavery is completely outlawed in 1865. And so these southern states, if they want to come back into the Union, they had to ratify the 13th Amendment, get rid of slavery, and the 14th Amendment as well, which we'll talk about, I think. So the South loses out on this labor system, and so they pass what are known as black codes, which is essentially slavery by a different name. Black codes are going to restrict the freedom of African Americans, where they can travel. They can't leave city limits. They can't be out at night. They couldn't do all this stuff. During the daytime, they had to be working for a white person. There were contracts that looked very much like slavery. And so under black codes, things didn't change that much for these former slaves. And so black codes will ultimately be outlawed by the 14th Amendment, which the Equal Protection Clause. Essentially, you can't have separate laws for separate people. Of course, this will be a big issue when we get to the Civil Rights Movement and Brown versus Board of Education and schools and all this stuff, Plessy versus Ferguson and all this stuff. But the 14th Amendment outlaws black codes. You can't have separate laws for separate people, and that's what black codes were. And so the system that kind of the economic system for many farmers in the South is going to be, they're going to be sharecroppers. This is the poor white people and poor black people, because they couldn't afford to buy their own land. They would essentially rent land, but instead of giving money, they would give a share of their crop as rent, if you will. And this would last, well into the 1930s even. And we saw the effects of this with the New Deal and the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which gave farmers money to not farm, but this did not apply to sharecroppers. So that's one way that the New Deal kind of didn't apply to black people and didn't really help them. Anyways, we'll talk about that when we get there. But the Freedmen's Bureau was created. This is kind of one of the first experiments in social welfare, and this idea that government should be there as a safety net to help the welfare of its citizens. Ideas that pick up during the Progressive Era and during the New Deal. This is kind of the beginning of that, to help these former slaves, these freed men, to adjust to life as a free person. These are people that were denied an education for years, and help them kind of adjust, go to school, get training, learn how to farm, learn carpentry, all this stuff. And the Democrats were largely opposed to the Freedmen's Bureau. And Andrew Johnson is going to try to veto all this stuff. So the plan with Reconstruction, what do we do? How do we bring the South, the southern states, back into the Union? And there's going to be various plans. Lincoln's plan is a 10% plan. Once the 10% of the people pledge their oath of loyalty, they can enter into the Union. The radical Republicans in Congress wanted it to be 50%. They wanted to really stick it to the South and really treat the South as a conquered territory. And the radical Republicans are going to do that. They're going to send in the military. They're going to divide the South into military districts and force the South to give black people their rights. So during this kind of radical Reconstruction, led by the radical Republicans, we will see black people voting freely. And when they can vote freely, they're going to elect, themselves. And so we're going to see, black senators and representatives and governors, and they were successful. Later on, after the Compromise of 1877, where the military leaves, the South goes back to home rule, or the Redeemer governments as they were known. And it's at that point we really see the restrictions on, voting rights and all this stuff. That again will be fixed with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So for a while, Reconstruction was fairly, so in the short term, I guess I would argue that Reconstruction was somewhat of a success in some areas. But in the long term, many people in the North just kind of got tired of it, just really weren't interested in this anymore, and let the South really go back into the hands of these racist white people in many ways. So you see the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that's essentially the 14th Amendment. It was made permanent with the 14th Amendment. And then we get the 15th Amendment, which is you can't deny someone the right to vote based on the color of their skin. Obviously, there's going to be ways around that. Literacy tests, poll taxes, all harassment, violence, all these ways to get around this. So on paper, it looks nice, but if the government isn't going to step in and make sure that these people are getting their rights, then a law is not really worth very much, right? So, even the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, that you can't have separate laws for separate people. And there was. We're going to see Jim Crow up until the 1960s. So if the federal government doesn't step in, then, a law is not really worth all that much. So on paper it looks well, but the reality is going to be very different until the 1960s when things start to really change. And so after the 14th, 15th Amendment, and after the Compromise of 1877, we see Jim Crow laws, which I just talked about. These are laws really that were meant to separate the races. Separate schools, separate restaurants, separate everything. Cities were essentially split in half in many places. And last thing I'll talk about here is the women's rights movement. This was also included in the key concept outline, so I mentioned it kind of in the last lecture, but the beginning of the women's rights movement, 1848, Seneca Falls, they lay out their declaration modeled on the Declaration of Independence, kind of all the things that men have done bad to women instead of, the king. It's men. And this kind of begins the trek towards voting rights, which ultimately they will get in 1920. So that is period 5. I will be back with period 6.